So I'm Elisabeth Clemens. I'm on the sociology faculty at the University of Chicago, and my work falls at the intersection of organizational sociology, political sociology, and then American political history. So I'm interested in the organizational processes that help us to understand the trajectory of state development in the United States, and then subsequently thinking about those transformations more comparatively and globally. Well, so as in many things, it began in graduate school with a job, a research assistantship, working for Theda Skocpol on an important book on the American welfare state. And what we found was that the kinds of actors that we thought should be important based on the political science work, well, they were important, parties were important, etc. But all kinds of other groups were also not just mobilizing, but actively puzzling about how to find political leverage, how to gain influence over political outcomes. And so there was a very specific moment looking at the records of an agricultural organization in California that votes to appropriate money to send a representative to the state legislature to take notes about what was discussed, what was voted on. But then the next vote is that they will not publish that. So sort of there was this puzzle about groups outside of the political system and how they thought they could monitor politics and then mobilize voters. So many of the things we now take for granted were actually invented at this period in the late 19th and early 20th century for outside groups to mobilize political leverage. So a very specific moment. So I began thinking about groups outside of politics and how they learn to be political actors, to gain political leverage. My more recent work has been thinking about the state and the arrangements of governance as comprising both public and private organizations. And for a long stretch of American history, many of the groups that were very important were voluntary associations, really from the Civil War through World War II. And that created a state with a very open architecture, so a non-Weberian state, a very thin bureaucracy, a national state that didn't have sufficient personnel to do much of its work and required private groups as allies. Following World War II, the balance of identity of those private groups really changes. So volunteers are much less useful in fighting modern wars. There's not much they can do. As government services and activities become more technical, there's less volunteers can do. And the federal government relied more and more on contracting with private firms. So if we want to understand how the post-World War II U.S. government became globally hegemonic, we need to understand how it develops relationships with private firms. And these are not well understood because so much of this is really encompassed in very boring contracts and negotiations. It's not in the newspapers. It's not dramatic like social movements, but quietly, much of the capacity of the public sphere in the United States and elsewhere with moves to privatizing more generally, much of that capacity exists in kinds of organizations that are not recognized as formally political, that are not democratically accountable. Lots, but I think the question does point to a real shift over recent decades where before business schools had PhD programs in organizations, almost everyone on the faculty had been trained in a sort of standard social science discipline, often organizational sociology. And as there was increased movement into business schools, I think two things happened. One was that the meaning of organization became somewhat restricted. So organizations were increasingly equated with for-profit firms, and that's where the best data was available on populations of for-profit firms. And at the same time, I think many sociology departments decided that, organizational sociology, that's gone to business schools. And so they forgot that schools and churches and nonprofits, as well as firms, are all organizations, and that's really a core piece of sociology. So I think that as business school programs are now very open to thinking about public-private arrangements and forms of alliance with nonprofits, with other kinds of organizations, there's an opportunity to bring that back together, which will both expand the meaning of organization within business schools, but I hope also lead to a re-energizing of organizational sociology within sociology departments. And I think a lot of that will happen around the area of economic sociology, which has been one of the truly vibrant new fields in sociology departments. So my own choices are really driven by the fact that I like big, messy problems that can only ultimately be dealt with in a book. So I tend to start by thinking of projects as book projects, which are jointly driven by an interest in a topic and a set of theoretical concerns. But at the beginning, it's not always clear how those will come together. And that's a long, long process. And then the journal articles come along more because, you find a piece of that is sort of well delineated that you can do in a journal article, or there's an invitation for a particular kind of piece, or increasingly to create opportunities to collaborate with graduate students. And my co-author on the paper today, Yuhao Zhuang, is now a PhD from Chicago who is on a postdoc at HEC. So that project really came about as a way to collaborate and work together. I think what has changed for people coming into academia now is the luxury of time. When I went on the job market the first time long, long ago, I had 3 publications, only one of which was peer-reviewed. The other 2 were, 2 were peer-reviewed. One was solo, one was a chapter, and that was a lot. That would hardly get you in the door for a top-level job now. And I think there's just much more emphasis on publishing early and often, and that often means that people don't have the space and time to start with a big, messy topic and figure out how it will take form. Basically, projects have to be conceived from the beginning as if they are already article projects. So, different journals have different places in the discipline, and AJS, I think, conceives of itself as the place that publishes articles that go beyond a subfield, right? So what is the piece in stratification that everyone should read? What is the piece of sort of ethnographic research on gender that everyone should read. So we look for articles that ideally would advance a innovative, important theoretical idea with great original data and the latest methods. Now, you hardly ever get an article with all three, but you often get articles with two that are the piece that someone who might regularly read, organization studies and organization science, well, that's the piece on schools as organizations that wouldn't show up in their subfield journals that they should read, or that's the piece that on stratification and mobility that really shakes up some of the assumptions in the standard literature. So those are the articles that we particularly look for. So it was absolutely fantastic. One of the absolutely decisive opportunities for my career and my circle of friends was being part of that group. I think part of it was that it was a period in which Arizona as a university was in a position to be quite ambitious. There's a very specific Arizona story about how a university president basically made an offer to all the departments in the university where basically you can keep the same budget you have and stay the same department that you are, or if you want to sort of really change the quality of the department, there was a stream of money for that. But that meant that the people who were in the department had to be willing to hire in people who had quite different trajectories. So the origins of it really belong with a very generous group of faculty who were there in the 1960s and early 1970s and who were just terrifically opportunistic. When they sort of saw someone who was really interesting but didn't quite fit at the place they were, was doing something a little outside the lines, they were able to recruit them. And they kept it a very functioning, friendly department. There was no reason that anyone went there except for this great department in formation. So I think part of what keeps that group alive is that, yes, people left for, different opportunities for different reasons, but the ties among people remain strong. And I think the other thing that was really important is it meant that we were all reading similar things. There was a kind of focus of sort of having a group with overlapping interests in a period where you were still dependent on the physical copy of AJS or ASR showing up, reading it together, having those authors coming through the weekly seminars. So there was a much more sustained focus, I think, on particular kinds of questions that led to a kind of sensibility that informs all of our work, even as we've gone in different directions. And for me in particular, I was trained at Chicago in a way of thinking about problems that were really about comparative statics. Why is this welfare state like that welfare state or unlike that one? And coming to Arizona, it's like, oh, I guess I do social movements. Here are some theoretical tools for thinking about institutional change. So I, in some ways, came with the empirical understanding of the cases, but that movement to Arizona shifted the theoretical lens in an incredibly fruitful way. So I'm deeply grateful. Okay, I'm going to give you two.
Please.
The first is a 2002 piece in Research in the Sociology of Organizations that was an appreciation of that amazing Art Stinchcomb article from the mid-1960s that has been a gift to people in search of a dissertation ever since then. And it was on not just sort of hybridization and innovation, but also sort of diffusion and reproduction. So I think one of the really important tendencies in both the social movement and the strategy worlds of organizational sociology is to think about hybridization. But the argument there is, in nature, most hybrids are sterile. They don't reproduce. And we don't, I think, spend enough time asking about what happens once there is a sort of recognizable success that comes from a hybrid. Does it just die? Or under what conditions do hybrids that depend on different and unique mixes of resources and inputs and legitimating ideologies, whatever, how do those persist and reproduce? And I'd say the second piece is a 2010 piece in Theory and Society that basically makes the argument from civic gifts, but really focuses on business networks and the way in which they're a site that perform this important alchemy for democracy where wealthy people become leading citizens. And that disappearing of the economic inequality into a performance of civic equality is, I think, a really important moment for people in business schools who are thinking now more expansively about public and private. I think time and sort of temporal horizons is the central dilemma. There is, as we talked about before, this pressure to formulate a project immediately that can become an article, that can be published so that you can get the fellowship, so you can get the postdoc, so that you can get that first tenure track job. But weighed against that is the fact that you have to stay interested in the topic for a long time. And I think the pressures of the moment can, in some ways, lead people to be so pragmatic, so instrumental, that they forget that the thing that keeps you going is the passion for the project. And you have to listen for that and hold on to that, even if you can't figure out how to do it just now in time for the next conference or the next grant proposal. So just being aware that the set of immediate incentives carries this risk of pushing you towards projects that are doable, but perhaps away from the projects which generate the passion that will keep you going through a postdoc, through a first job, onto tenure. That's a real tension. People negotiate it in different ways, but recognizing that it's there is, I think, very, very important.